Welcome to another episode of Science Horror. All our stories are fictional and written by me. I've been told I have to say that, and also they're not keeping me hostage. This week's story was taken from the journal of Dr. F. Pritchard, who along with Professor T.F. Chepley was shot dead by the police last year after taking a random passerby hostage whom they insisted was working for MI5. It should be noted that the herbal supplement that Dr. Pritchard refers to has since been declared toxic, and the company that manufactured the supplement has been shut down. Until I was in my 30s, I barely knew what anxiety even was. I don't believe I honestly worried about anything, ever. As a scientist specialising in pharmacological research, my job paid well, and I always knew that if I somehow lost my existing job, I'd easily find another, so money was never a worry for me. My health has always been excellent, so I've never worried about that either. Then I founded a company with some friends and former colleagues, and that's when the anxiety started to take a hold of me. I became acutely aware that things could easily go wrong, and I could end up being seen as a terrible failure, or worse. My marriage started to get a little rocky around the same time, and I began to worry about that too. It used to come on me at night. The whole day I'd be fine, but then when darkness fell and I was supposed to sleep, and I was, in a sense, alone with my thoughts, my wife sound asleep at my side, that was when the anxiety would start to eat at me. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, and my heart would pound unpleasantly. What if things go wrong? What if things go wrong? I would imagine losing my wife, my house, my children, and there seemed to be nothing stopping all that from happening, other than the tenuous hopes we had pinned on certain lines of pharmacological research. I didn't want to take any kind of drug for it because I was afraid it might cloud my mind, or I might get addicted to it. I didn't put any store in counsellors either. Alcohol has never made me tired. I've never had a taste for it. I tried chamomile tea to help me get to sleep, but it didn't really work. Apparently it really does have some sort of active substance in it. It made me feel sleepy, but I didn't actually sleep, and if anything, it made me a little paranoid. Valerian seemed to me to have a bit of a dubious profile, so I didn't fancy it. Then my friend T, I've censored his name out of respect for his family, suggested goosegrass to me. He had been taking it for a few years, he said, and he'd found it extremely helpful. There was this lab in Germany somewhere that had gone through books of old herbal remedies and had discovered that goosegrass root, fermented in a very particular way, was once considered an effective anti-anxiety, sleep-inducing medicine. For some reason, it had fallen out of favour and had been all but forgotten. They'd created an extract which they sold in tablet form, and my friend T said it was very good at helping him forget his worries and get a good night's sleep. He gave me a couple of pills. I tried them, and it was like a miracle. I totally lost the tendency to ruminate over horrible possibilities when I was trying to sleep. Instead, I fell asleep quickly and slept like a baby. I immediately ordered several packets, and from then on, I was never without a goosegrass tablet when it was time to sleep. I'm still never without one now, even though this terrible and absurd cloud of suspicion has fallen over it. The couple of years after that, I look back on very fondly now. T and I used to meet for a coffee once a week and discuss mainly philosophy and psychology, and often would laugh like schoolchildren. T had a wonderful sense of humour and a tremendous knack for impersonating people. He often had me in stitches with his mimicry. In retrospect, the first changes I noticed in T were personality changes, but that's in retrospect. I didn't think much of them at the time. We were walking in the street one day when he said, "That guy's watching us." I followed his line of sight. All I could see was an old man reading a newspaper on a bench. I thought he was joking, so I played along with it. "Probably CIA or MI5, I said. "I've seen him before," said T. "I'm going to write to the council about this. I'm sick of it. What does he want?" "Probably planning to steal your organs," I said. "Do you think?" said T. He looked genuinely alarmed. "You're joking, aren't you?" I said. "Of course not. It's just an old man reading a newspaper." The scared look on T's face persisted for some moments, then suddenly relaxed into a smile. "Yeah, you're probably right," he said. There were several incidents like that. I was never 100% sure he wasn't joking, but he seemed to be getting genuinely paranoid. He kept talking about writing to people and complaining about various imagined forms of persecution. Not long after that, the physical problems began. We were walking up a slight gradient on the way to have a coffee, and he slowed to an absolute crawl. "Come on, old woman," I said, laughing. "We'll never get there at this rate. Your arthritis bothering you?" He didn't laugh like he usually would have done. Instead, he said, "I can't go any faster." "Why not?" I said. "I don't know, I just can't. I can't make my legs move faster." "What, seriously?" I said. "Are you tired?" "No, they just won't go any faster than this," he said. He looked worried. It was certainly odd, but everyone has weird physical problems at one time or another, so I didn't think much about it. I saw him again several days later and he seemed fine. I thought it had just been a weird one-off thing, and that's probably what he thought too, but we were wrong. The thing with his legs started to happen more and more often, and then it began to affect his arms. He said it sometimes felt like he couldn't make them exert their full strength when he needed to. It came and went, but over the next few months, it started to happen more and more often. I told him to see a doctor, and he did. That kicked off a whole round of tests. At the end, they said he had Barbellion's disease, a rare disease that causes steadily escalating nerve and brain problems. It's incurable and it's fatal. They said he had only 2 years left to live. T took it surprisingly well, but obviously it was a huge shock to him. It was a shock to everyone. I started reading everything I could about Barbellion's disease. I read all the research papers. I read every book I could find that seemed like it might contain something I didn't already know. I read up on all the different conjectures as to what causes it. The cause was, and still is, considered to be completely unknown. The leading hypothesis holds that the immune system starts to attack nerve tissue, but why it would do that is anyone's guess. T was facing a swift and inexorable descent into paralysis, dementia, and madness. As a scientist, I was determined to do everything I possibly could to help T, none of the recent scientific literature seemed to offer much hope. There were drugs that were thought to possibly delay the decline by a month or two, but they all had horrendous side effects, and in the end changed nothing. I realised that if I was to find anything that might be of serious assistance to my dear friend, I was going to have to go beyond the present scientific literature, or outside of it. It was then that I came across the intriguing hypothesis of Richard Hasling, who had been a professor at a German university. Hasling claimed to have found spirochetes in the spinal fluid of people who were suffering from Barbellion's disease. He believed these spirochetes to have caused the illness. Furthermore, he noted that the disease had been entirely absent from Iceland until American troops were stationed there during World War II, exactly as if the disease had been transmitted by an infectious agent. Hasling's research had been dismissed and ignored, but why? The reason wasn't hard to uncover. A certain renowned professor at Oxford by the name of Williams had been unable to detect these spirochetes himself, and had gradually persuaded everyone of the immunological hypothesis instead, the immune system being his own speciality. It became clear to me that the true cause of Barbellion's was these spirochetes, tiny spiral-shaped bacteria similar to those found in syphilis, and that Williams had simply perverted the course of research to further his own career. Once I realised that, it was only a case of finding substances that could kill the spirochetes without killing the patient. This proved more difficult than one might have hoped. They were evidently resistant to antibiotics, but eventually I uncovered some research that suggested that certain lanthanides, the so-called rare earth metals, could be effective. These metals are toxic, certainly, but it seemed to me that carefully adjusted frequent doses should be able to destroy the spirochetes without killing the patient. I communicated my findings to T as soon as I was reasonably certain of the whole thing. "You mean I have bacteria in my brain?" said T. "That's exactly what I'm saying," I said. "Right now they're replicating and your symptoms are worsening, but I believe we can halt the progress of the disease and probably cure it." "How?" he said. "Infusions of certain obscure metals," I said, "once per week. They are toxic to the metabolism of the bacteria. It cannot replicate in their presence." "I may as well try it, I suppose. Are there side effects?" "I won't lie to you, T," I said. "The treatment's going to be tough. Certainly you'll have nausea and perhaps pain." "But the alternative is death," he said. "Yes," I said. "Then I may as well try it," he said. We were at his home in Oxford when we had this conversation, and I noticed he kept glancing out of the window while we spoke. "Are you okay?" I said. "You seem distracted." "There's a man out there," he said. "He's been watching my house. I've been doing some research and I'm almost sure now that he's with MI5. "Come now, T, why would MI5 be watching you?" I said. "I have some information and they want it," he said. "What information?" "Shh," he said, and he waved his finger around the room, as if pointing to invisible listening devices. It was quite clear to me that his condition was deteriorating. T worked in a bank and didn't have any secrets that MI5 might want. In any case, he was never very good at keeping secrets. If anyone had wanted to know anything that he knew, they only had to ask him. I therefore dismissed all of this as paranoid talk brought on by the illness. I gave T the first injection only a few days later. I used a simple soluble salt of 2 different metals, both of which I believed should have a strong effect upon the spirochetes. He was quite sick for the next 3 days, although he said he felt physically stronger, which was very heartening. Alas, a simple test of grip strength revealed only a slight further weakening rather than any improvement, but I was confident that was only due to the side effect of nausea. We kept the injections on a weekly schedule. As I had expected, the side effects were terrible. Week by week, T's condition continued to deteriorate, but I knew that eventually the lanthanides would destroy the spirochetes completely and the deterioration would halt. Once the underlying cause of their disease was cured, I had no doubt that some degree of recovery could be expected, although the disease would undoubtedly cause some quantity of permanent damage before we were able to master it. T deteriorated both physically and mentally. To his credit, I never once heard him complain about his illness. In that respect, he showed remarkable, some would say unnecessary courage. Rather, he complained endlessly about little things, or things that seemed little to others, but were no small matter to T. I vividly remember a time about 6 months after the first injection, when I met T in the town, together with our mutual friends Roger and Sarah. T wanted to go to a pharmacist and peruse the array of herbal and homeopathic medicines there, and for some reason Sarah and I decided we would go and carry out some other errand while he did that with Roger. By this time, T needed crutches to get around, and so someone really needed to go with him, because there was a distinct possibility of him falling over and not being able to get back up again. The thing that sticks in my mind about this incident is the look of alarm on Roger's face when he realised he might be left alone with T for a while. He pulled us aside and whispered, "Don't leave me alone with him," in a tone of panic. You see, by then T had become hard to stand. His once brilliant sense of humour had deteriorated to the point where at times everything amused him, and he laughed at the smallest thing with a terrible hollow laugh, while at other times he treated everything with a terrible seriousness, so that the slightest setback might cause him to burst into tears. About another 6 months after that, T could only get around in a wheelchair and was largely confined to his house. We often talked about the treatment and speculated as to the degree of recovery that he might expect when the spirochetes were finally killed. Neither of us doubted the spirochete hypothesis itself, nor that the weekly injections of lanthanides would eventually cure him. It was just a question of time, and a question of how much permanent damage T's organism would sustain before we could get a handle on the disease. Whenever we spoke, T would constantly throw suspicious glances out of the window, saying MI5 were watching him and had become desperate to extract certain secrets from him. They had also tapped his phone, he said. As to what secrets he might have that they would want, he still couldn't tell me, but he was convinced that he knew something of great value, and it was imperative that no government agency should find out about it. I had to keep distracting him from the topic, otherwise he would have talked about nothing but that, even though he was also convinced that his house was wired with listening devices from top to bottom. Not long after that, a terrible thing occurred that vividly confirmed the spirochete theory, not that confirmation was needed. I myself began to experience the weakness in my limbs with which T's illness had begun. It was quite clear to me what had happened. Due to my frequent contact with tea, the spirochetes had spread somehow into my bloodstream. I undoubtedly now had Barbellion's disease, but the fortunate thing was that I had the cure at hand and had caught it early, so I began to inject myself with the lanthanides immediately. T was unfortunately showing no signs of improvement and continued to deteriorate. He was forced to take on carers who visited him 4 times a day to feed and wash him and get him into bed in the evening. Clearly, we were using an insufficient dose of the rare earth metals. This now became obvious to both of us. We had been much too cautious. I doubled the dose. By then, T was more than willing to put up with the horrific side effects, the nausea and effects on his vision. At all cost, we had to destroy the spirochete infection completely. I remember visiting T once and staying for several hours. A carer arrived and had to feed T with a spoon, and even then the food kept going down the wrong way and choking him. His muscles were so weak that he couldn't steer the food correctly into his stomach, and even had trouble chewing it. It was so terribly sad to see my friend T, once so full of life, reduced to such a state. Even then he had not completely lost his formerly brilliant sense of humour, but now, when he laughed, he risked choking himself and fell into awful fits of coughing. I myself had taken to using crutches by then, and we talked a great deal about the spirochetes and how best to finish them off as quickly as possible. Certainly in T's case the cure was taking far too long. T swore that when he closed his eyes he could actually see the spirochetes swirling around in the aqueous humour of his eyes. This seemed to me likely impossible. The spirochetes are microscopic, but I wondered whether it might conceivably be possible to see microscopic objects that are within the eye itself. T was adamant that he could definitely see them. Tragedy struck shortly after that. T was abruptly admitted to hospital with pneumonia. In hospital, I was unable to continue the lanthanide injections, and he died. The poignancy of the affair was gut-wrenching. We had been so close to a cure, yet the prospect had been cruelly taken from us by a blinkered medical establishment who refused to acknowledge the truth of spirochete infection. At this point, the intertwined stories of T and myself took a further horrible twist. The useless doctors at the hospital claimed there were certain irregularities in T's condition, and they ordered an autopsy. The autopsy attributed T's death not to the true cause, the spirochetes, but to the lanthanides with which I had been injecting him. Not only that, but the coroner claimed the characteristic signs of Barbellion's disease, which can only be definitively detected after death, were entirely absent. T, they said, had been misdiagnosed. Suspicion initially fell on T's veritable cornucopia of herbal remedies. The police had all of them tested for the presence of rare earth metals. When those tests came up negative, attention was drawn to the unusual quantity of needle marks on T's arms. They began to question his friends, of which I, by then, was perhaps the closest. The changes and deterioration in T's personality had scared away most of his other friends by the end, even friends of much longer standing than myself. The attention of the police was particularly drawn to the fact that I appeared to be suffering from similar but less advanced symptoms to those suffered by T before he died, and eventually they took me to the police station for questioning. It was there that they forced me to roll up my sleeves, displaying the needle marks that I had carefully hidden from them. Things seemed to happen very quickly from that point onwards. They wanted to charge me with murder. They called me a quack, a monster, a charlatan. The local newspapers got hold of it and heaped derision upon me. Finally, they decided that I was not evil but insane, and I was forcibly admitted to a secure psychiatric facility. Of course, you will readily understand what this meant. I was infected with the spirochetes, and without regular lanthanide injections, I was sure to deteriorate. I knew that unless I got out of there, I would be dead within a year and a half, yet there seemed no prospect of escape. In the hospital, I could not even obtain the fermented goosegrass root, upon which I had relied so long for sound sleep, but they pumped me so full of drugs anyway that sleep wasn't a problem. I was forced to talk to some dreadful psychiatrist on a regular basis, which was an additional torment in addition to everything else. At first I half wondered whether T had not in fact held some secret that MI5 wanted to get hold of, and whether the whole thing might be part of some twisted attempt to find out if I knew the secret, now that T was dead. I tried to explain to them that there probably was no such secret, and that T was simply paranoid due to the spirochetes, but they would hear no talk of spirochetes, and tried to tell me that it was I who was paranoid. The only small source of comfort to me in those dark times was that the disease did not seem to progress and actually improved somewhat. I have no doubt that some of the psychiatric medications they fed me exerted an antibacterial effect on the spirochetes, probably insufficient to cure the disease, but sufficient to hold it off for a while. All the same, I knew that the disease would get me in the end. It might have taken another 2 years rather than only a year and a half, but my end would be the same, and an extra 6 months in that dreadful facility was hardly a blessing. It was then that the gods of fortune unexpectedly smiled upon me. A renowned professor by the name of Chepley heard of my case and visited me at the hospital. I explained everything to him, and he revealed that he, too, was in the initial stages of Barbellion's disease. He was absolutely fascinated to hear about my research on the spirochetes and my near cure of T, which had only been prevented by the intervention of the dunderheaded medical authorities. I could see the light of hope dawning in his eyes, and doubtless he could see the same in mine. He pledged to get me out of there, and he was as good as his word. Somehow he managed to convince the authorities to release me into his care, and he kindly put me up in a room at his home in Winchester. Most miraculously of all, when you consider the odds, it turned out that he too was a devotee of fermented goosegrass root and couldn't sleep or settle his mind without it. Remarkably, he told me that T's fear of MI5 might not have been entirely unfounded. He too was being watched, and he suspected that a government agency was involved. I have now resided with Professor Chepley for some months, and we are fighting a terrible battle against the spirochetes with high doses of the lanthanides. At least T's death will not have been in vain. He showed us that one must use extremely high doses in order to cure the disease in a timely fashion. God willing, I will have dispensed with these crutches within a year. Meanwhile, it seems we really are being watched. I now believe that T really did have some vital piece of information that the authorities intended to acquire via subterfuge, and are still attempting to acquire even now, if only I knew what. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, Please devote the next 10 years to clearing Dr. Pritchard's name and exposing the alleged MI5 plot against him. Also, if you are able to detect a like button anywhere near this recording, please consider clicking it and subscribing. That would help to ensure the authorities continue to allow me to bring you these stories from our almost incomprehensibly vast archives. Thank you. My name's John, and this is Science Horror. New episode every Monday.
They're outside now. They're watching us. Professor Chepley and I won't let them take us alive.